A toast to my son, who confused betrayal with intelligence.
She sat across from the woman sleeping with her husband and smiled, because smiling was still the most dangerous thing she knew how to do. Claire Whitmore had spent 3 years being the quiet wife of Daniel Whitmore, one of the most powerful men in New York. She signed a contract marriage, kept her head down, and learned the rules of a world that never quite let her in. But while everyone watched Daniel, Claire was watching something else entirely. A woman named Vanessa Lorne had been moving through the Whitmore family, like a slow tide, pulling things toward an edge that nobody had named out loud yet. On the night of the Whitmore family's 40th anniversary dinner, a single toast from Daniel's father changed everything. What followed was not a story about a wife who got revenge. It was a story about a woman who finally decided she was worth fighting for, and who had been preparing for exactly this fight without realizing it. Chapter 1. A dinner table with one empty chair and one too many. The Whitmore estate in Greenwich had a way of making people feel they were arriving somewhere that mattered. The driveway was a quarter-mile of white gravel lined with maples that turned gold and copper every October without being asked. In early November, most of the leaves had come down, and the bare branches against the darkening sky gave the whole approach a severity that felt deliberate, like the house itself was reminding you to stand up straight before you knocked. Claire had driven herself, not because she had to, but because she preferred it. 3 years of Whitmore family dinners had taught her that arriving in your own car meant you could leave in your own car. And that was a kind of freedom people tended to underestimate until the moment they needed it badly. She parked on the far side of the circular drive and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the warm light coming through the dining room windows and the dark thoughts of guests already inside. She checked her reflection in the side mirror. Dark green dress, pearl earrings her mother had left her, lipstick the color of a deep rose. Then she got out into the cold. Margaret was waiting on the front steps with her arms crossed against the November air. Daniel's younger sister was 42 and had inherited their father's particular gift for noticing things that other people assumed were invisible. She had also inherited his talent for saying exactly what she meant without raising her voice. "You are early," Margaret said. "I am on time," Claire said. "He is late." The main dining room had been set for 14. White linen, the good silver that only came out twice a year, and low centerpieces of white hydrangeas and dried magnolia leaves, arranged so that everyone could see each other across the table without craning. Edward believed dinner tables were for looking at the people you were eating with. He had said that once, years ago, at some gathering Claire barely remembered anymore, and it had stayed with her. She thought about it sometimes when she and Daniels sat at their own table in the Central Park West apartment, the two of them looking at their phones. She found her place card and sat down on Edward's left. The seat to his right was empty. That was Daniel's place. The other guests filed in over the following 20 minutes. Edward's sister Constance, sharp as ever at 73. Senior board members James Aldrich and his wife Patricia. Daniel's old college friend Brooks Calloway, who had been absorbed into the Whitmore social orbit years ago and never fully detached himself. 3 others from the extended family that Claire had met enough times to know by name, and not much else. Edward came in last. He always did, not to make an entrance, but because he spent the last few minutes before any gathering moving through the space, checking that everything was where it should be. He was 71 and still moved like a man who felt entirely at home on the ground beneath his feet. He kissed Claire on the cheek before he sat. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she said. He paused the way he sometimes did with her, as though measuring out how much to say. Then he unfolded his napkin, laid it across his knee, and the moment passed. They were halfway through the appetizers when the front door opened. Claire heard it before she looked up. The specific register of Daniel's voice in the entrance hall, low and quick, the tone he used when he needed to seem relaxed about something he was not relaxed about at all. He walked in with Vanessa Lorne 2 steps behind him. Daniel Whitmore, at 47, had the kind of presence that made people shift slightly when he entered a room. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a suit that fit the way. Suits fit people who never have to think about cost. He was also 15 minutes late at his father's table, which at Edward's table was not a minor thing regardless of the excuse. "Traffic on 95, Daniel said, pulling out his chair. Vanessa settled into the seat beside him, the one that had belonged to Brooks's wife, Anna, who was quietly reshuffled 2 places down without complaint. Rosa, who had managed the household for 28 years, accomplished the adjustment without a word or a visible reaction. She had been handling things without words or visible reactions for a long time. Claire was talking to Constance about a garden restoration project in Westchester. She was listening, nodding, asking the right questions at the right moments, and she was seeing everything. Vanessa Lorne was somewhere around 40. Good bone structure, dark haircut to just below the shoulders, the posture of a woman who had learned early that how you carried yourself was half the conversation. She was in corporate restructuring, Daniel had said, out of the London office, which was why he had introduced her to his father 6 months ago as an advisor on the current reorganization. They had met formally at a company event in September. Vanessa had said it was so nice to finally meet her, in a tone that was warm and perfectly calibrated, and told Claire exactly nothing about who she actually was. Tonight, Vanessa was seated close enough to Daniel that their arms would brush when either of them reached for water. She moved through the table, conversation easily, laughed at the right moments, asked questions that showed she had researched the people she was meeting. She was very good at this. Claire had been watching her for months and had never once caught her being anything other than exceptionally good at it. The main course arrived. Braised short ribs, Edward's standard for this dinner, the same dish Rosa had made for every major Whitmore, gathering for decades. There was something about the consistency of it that felt like a statement, though Edward had never said so directly. Somewhere in the third round of cross-table conversation, Constance mentioned a recent piece in the financial press about the Carver Group's new acquisition strategy. That family never knew when to stop pushing, Constance said with the tone of someone who had watched certain patterns repeat over decades and had stopped being surprised by any of them. Marcus Carver is aggressive, James Aldrich said, but he is not reckless. Give him that. Daniel weighed in. He had real opinions about what the Carver Group's last several acquisition signaled about their positioning. He spoke for 2 minutes, informed and direct. During those 2 minutes, Claire watched Vanessa. Vanessa was cutting her meat in careful, even strokes. She did not look up. She did not contribute anything to the conversation about the Carver family. What she did was redirect, not obviously, not in a way anyone would notice, unless they were already paying close attention. Vanessa turned to Margaret on her left and asked something about a renovation project Margaret had mentioned earlier. Margaret answered. The table drifted naturally away from the Carvers and onto something else. It lasted 30 seconds, that pivot. Nothing remarkable. Claire set her fork down briefly and picked it back up. Dessert was a pear tart with creme anglaise. Rosa brought it out herself, which she did only when Edward had specifically asked. He let the dessert plates be arranged before he stood. This was the moment everyone at the table had been waiting for. Edward Whitmore's annual toast was part institution, part family ritual. Sometimes brief and warm, occasionally reaching back into the history of the company. Once, the year Daniel's mother died, it had been barely a minute long, and those few sentences had carried more weight than most speeches carry in 20. Edward understood the specific power of a short sentence, delivered at exactly the right moment. He picked up his glass. The table went quiet the way it always did. Even Brooks put his fork down. 40 years, Edward said. He let those 2 words stand alone for a moment. 40 years since William Hargrove and I signed a piece of paper in a building that has since been demolished and replaced with a parking garage. which tells you something about how the world treats its own history. A small laugh moved around the table. He paused. What we built was never just a company. It was a set of principles about how you treat the people working alongside you, about how you make decisions you can still live with 20 years later when you are sitting in a room like this one. He looked at James Aldrich, at Constance, at Brooks. His gaze moved slowly around the table, and the room was so still that Claire could hear the fire in the adjacent sitting room, the soft tick of the clock on the sideboard. Then Edward looked at Daniel, and did not stop there. His eyes moved one more seat and settled on Claire. "Tonight," he said, "I want to raise a glass to the person at this table who has protected what we built, who did it quietly, without being asked, and without any expectation of acknowledgement. The person who understood what this company is, not as an inheritance, not as an asset to be managed, but as something worth the effort of keeping whole. The person who has been paying attention when others were looking elsewhere." He raised his glass to Claire. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, more happened than in the previous 3 hours. James Aldrich was the first to raise his glass. Constance followed without hesitation. Margaret raised hers immediately, and her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the wine. Daniel's glass did not move. He was looking at his father with the specific stillness of a man who has just heard something in a public room that he expected to manage in private, who is calculating every possible response and finding none of them adequate. His jaw was set. He was completely still. Vanessa's glass went up at exactly the right moment. Warm expression, gracious tilt of the head, the face of someone receiving a pleasant surprise at a dinner party. Nothing off about it, nothing anyone could point to. But Claire had been watching Vanessa's hands all evening. For 2 or 3 seconds, before the glass came up, Vanessa's right hand had tightened hard around the stem. A white knuckle grip, released quickly. The kind of thing your body does when your mind is moving faster than your composure can keep pace with. Claire raised her own glass. She drank. One sip, steady. Set the glass down without a sound. She did not look at Daniel. She looked at Edward, who was looking back at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Something careful and quiet, and underneath it, something that looked very much like relief. "Thank you, Edward," she said. Her voice was even. He nodded once and sat down. Conversation returned to the table. It took a moment to find its footing, but it returned. The way well-mannered people at well-mannered tables always manage to recover from the uncomfortable thing and continue. Brooks made a comment about the pear tart. James Aldrich asked Margaret something about her work. The evening found its rhythm again. Across the table, Daniel had turned to Vanessa and was speaking low. Claire could not make out the words. She did not try. Margaret refilled Claire's water glass without saying anything. It was the kindest gesture of the entire evening. About 40 minutes later, as the dinner party began to dissolve in the natural way, Claire excused herself, saying she had left her wrap in the coat room off the entrance hall. She walked through the corridor, lined with photographs, company milestones, a black and white of Edward and William Hargrove in front of their first office building. Both of them looking around 30 and entirely certain about what came next. She stood in the coat room. It was small and quiet, and she was alone in it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, an unfamiliar number, but she recognized the area code. The same exchange as the law firm Edward had used for over 2 decades. The message was one word: ready. She read it twice. She locked the screen and put the phone back in her bag. Then she walked back out. Steady, composed, her face giving away nothing. Margaret was the only one close enough to see her eyes when she returned to the room. She looked at Claire for a long moment. Then she looked away and smiled at someone nearby was saying. That was the thing about the women in this family. They had learned, over time and out of necessity, how to hold something close without showing it. And on this particular evening in Greenwich, with the fire burning in the next room and the good silver still on the table, that skill was the most valuable thing in the house. Chapter 2. The man who needed to be right more than he needed to be safe. Edward was in the library when Daniel arrived the next morning. That was intentional, and they both understood it. For 40 years, Edward Whitmore had used this room for difficult conversations. He had placed two leather chairs angled toward each other near the window because he believed desks put the wrong kind of distance between people. Here there were no hiding places. Two men, two chairs, and whatever needed to be said. Daniel came in without knocking and stood for a moment looking at his father. The morning light was thin and gray through the glass. Edward had a coffee on the table beside him and a manila folder resting on his knee, held shut with a simple clip. "You could have just called," Daniel said. "I could have," Edward said. "Sit down." Daniel sat. He kept his coat on. "I have been holding this for 4 months," Edward said. He set the folder on the small table between them. "I gave you time to see it yourself." "I thought you would." He paused. "I was wrong about that." Daniel looked at the folder without touching it. "What is it?" he said. "Vanessa Lorne has a financial relationship with a company called Meridian Advisory Group. Meridian was set up 18 months ago with seed capital that traces back through two shell companies to Carver Capital Partners." The room went very quiet. Outside the window, though, the bare oak stood against a flat gray sky. "That is a chain of inference," Daniel said. "It is a documented chain," Edward said. "There is a difference. People work with multiple firms. That does not mean anything." "Daniel," Edward said it quietly, without heat, and that was worse than if he had raised his voice. "Open the folder." Daniel picked it up, held it for a moment, then set it back down without opening it and stood. "This is what you do," he said. "Every time I make a decision you did not make for me, you find the flaw in it. For 10 years you have been doing this." "For 10 years I have been mostly right," Edward said. Again, without cruelty, just fact. "I trust your judgment in most things," Edward said slowly. "I do not trust your judgment about people who are giving you exactly what you want to hear. I never have. That is not a criticism of your character. It is a pattern I have watched in you since you were 23 years old, and I am telling you now, as directly as I know how, to open that folder." Daniel put his hands in his coat pockets. "I will look at it," he said. "When I have time." He walked out. Edward sat alone after the door closed. He looked at the manila folder for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee, found it had gone cold, and set it back down. He picked up his phone and sent a single text to his attorney. One word: confirmed. On the highway back to Manhattan, Daniel drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and his jaw tight. He was angry. And somewhere underneath the anger, in the honest part of him that he did not visit often, he knew that part of the anger was because his father had just been right about something Daniel could not yet prove wrong. He called Vanessa. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was warm and easy. And within 30 seconds the knot in his chest had begun to loosen. That was what she did. She had always done that from the very first dinner in London, the way she made a complicated room feel navigable. "The reorganization," he said. "First tranche, this week." A brief pause on her end. "That is ahead of schedule. Are you sure?" "Get the documents ready," he said. That afternoon in a conference room on the 44th floor of the Whitmore building on Park Avenue, Daniel signed the first tranche of what the reorganization summary described as a strategic asset rebalancing. The language was technically accurate. The documents did not mention that completing all three tranches would separate the founding asset from the current corporate structure. One tranche alone could not accomplish that, but it was the first step on a road whose end had been left off the map Vanessa had handed him. He read everything, because he always read everything. He found nothing that gave him pause. Vanessa walked out 2 steps behind the attorneys, and she was already composing the message to Marcus Carver in her head before she reached the elevator. That same afternoon, Claire met Margaret at a coffee shop on 48th Street. They had been walking somewhere else when it started to rain, and this was the nearest open door. The table was slightly wobbly and the coffee was adequate. And Margaret had been talking about things that did not matter for 20 minutes, which was her way of working up to something that did. He is going to do it, Margaret said finally, both hands around her mug. The asset transfer, whatever Vanessa has been steering him toward. He may have already started, Claire said. Margaret looked at her. You knew, I suspected. Claire. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Do you understand what that transfer actually does when all three parts go through? It removes the founding asset from the family trust structure. It enables it to move to an outside party, and your rights as a spouse under the original partnership agreement would be affected. Edward has been worried for months. I know, Claire said. I do not understand why you are so calm, Margaret said. Not accusatory. Genuinely trying to understand. Have you ever read the original Whitmore-Hargrove Partnership Agreement? Claire said. The 1987 version. Margaret blinked. No. Why would I have? Claire said. She picked up her coffee. I have spent about 18 months reading, not just that agreement, the legal history of the company. The amendment Edward filed when Daniel formally took over. She paused. I know what is in Section 14. What is in Section 14? Margaret said. Something useful, Claire said. When the time comes. They talked for another hour about other things. When they parted on the wet sidewalk, Margaret held her a moment longer than usual, and Claire let her. Claire took the subway to the small office she maintained separately from anything connected to Daniel or the Whitmore family. She had been using it for consulting work before the marriage and more recently for something else entirely. Daniel had never asked about it. That told her something about the marriage without either of them having to say it out loud. She sat down and opened her laptop. For the past 6 weeks, she had been working through the Whitmore Company's historical legal records through a shared document portal she technically had access to as Daniel's wife. Access that had never been revoked, because nobody had thought to revoke it, because nobody had imagined she would use it. She worked methodically and without hurry. She had been doing this long enough to know where things were and what she was looking for. She was not looking for what she found. The document was in a folder she had opened before. A restricted internal memo, flagged with a classification marking that meant it was accessible only to senior legal staff and the executive committee. It related to a preliminary assessment of the asset reorganization's structural implications. 2 internal attorneys had drafted it and initialed the bottom. Below their initials was a third set, handwritten on the external review acknowledged line. VL. Claire stared at the screen. She tilted it slightly, as if that would change what she was seeing. It did not. Vanessa Lorne had no legal standing to review a restricted internal memo. She was an external consultant. She was not on the legal team, not on the executive committee, not in any role that granted access to privileged internal analysis. There was no legitimate path by which her initials should appear on that document. Claire took out her phone and photographed the screen carefully, making sure the classification marking and the date and all 3 sets of initials were clearly visible. Then she closed the document, logged out, and sat with her hands flat on the desk. She thought about her father. Frank Halliwell had built a small but real commercial real estate business in Cincinnati over 22 years. He had taken on a partner named Gerald Bryce, who was charming and organized and full of good ideas, and who had been quietly siphoning off operating capital for 4 years before anyone could prove it. Her father had suspected it for the last 2 of those years. He had not acted because he did not want to be wrong, and because he did not want the confrontation, and because some part of him kept hoping he was mistaken. By the time it was undeniable, there was almost nothing left to protect. She was 15 years old, and she watched her father sit at the kitchen table for 3 days in a row without going into the office. She made a decision during those 3 days that she had never fully articulated out loud, but had never once deviated from. She was not going to be the person who waited. She called Carol Shen, her own attorney, a woman in Murray Hill, who had been her lawyer since before the Whitmore name was any part of Claire's life. "Are you free tomorrow morning?" she said. 7:30, Carol said. My office. Chapter 3. The ground shifts under everyone. Carol Shen's office smelled like good coffee and old paper, the combination of which Claire had always found reassuring in a way she could not entirely explain. Carol had been in this fourth-floor walk-up in Murray Hill for 14 years and showed no interest in leaving despite having well outgrown the square footage. One watercolor of the Hudson in winter hung on the wall behind her desk, purchased at a street fair in the 90s. Carol kept it, she had said once, to remind herself to be patient. Claire arrived at 7:25. Carol had 2 coffees ready. She handed over the photograph of the screen, printed rather than just on her phone. Because Carol had told her once that printing something made people take it more seriously, including herself. Carol studied it for a long time without saying anything. "Walk me through where this document is," she said. "Restricted internal portal. Legal and executive access only. I have had credentials since the beginning of the marriage. Nobody ever revoked them. Did you do anything to obtain access beyond what you already had?" "No. I used existing credentials, opened a folder I had accessed before. This document was there. Tell me about the reorganization," Carol said. "Everything." Claire spoke for 20 minutes, laying out the 3 tranches. The asset they were working toward separating, the timeline, what each piece did in isolation, and what all 3 pieces accomplished together. Carol made 3 small notes on a yellow legal pad and did not interrupt once. "You know about Section 14," Carol said when Claire finished. "The joint title provision on the founding asset," Claire said. "The 1987 agreement requires both partners, or their legal successors, to release any claim before the asset can transfer outside the partnership structure." Edward's side was absorbed into the Whitmore family trust in 1999. The founding asset currently sits under a dual title structure, with the corporate entity on one side and the family trust on the other. Carol looked at her steadily. "You have been doing your homework." 18 months, Claire said. "Does Vanessa know about Section 14?" Carol asked. "If she did, she would have neutralized it before she started," Claire said. "The fact that the first tranche went through without addressing it tells me she either did not find it or she assumed it was dormant after this many years." "It is not dormant," Carol said flatly. "It has been cited in 2 internal legal opinions since 2015, and both found it fully enforceable. Someone with incomplete access to the archive, or access obtained recently and informally, might have missed both of them." She paused. "There is a spousal interest mechanism under the original structure. A spouse of a named successor holds a contingent interest in the founding asset that can be activated by formal claim. If you filed, it would create an encumbrance on the founding asset that cannot be cleared without your written release. The transfer stops completely." "How long do I have to decide?" Claire said. "The claim holds for 48 hours on automatic stay," Carol said. "After that, it either has to be formally extended, which keeps you legally bound to the marriage in a specific way, or it lapses and the encumbrance lifts." "I am not ready to file yet," Claire said. "I want to see what the second tranche looks like first." "That is reasonable," Carol said. "But Claire, if Vanessa Bescas accelerates her timeline, you may have less room than you think." She did not have as much room as she thought. The second tranche documents appeared in Daniel's email at 2:47 that afternoon. Framed as a quarterly adjustment he had already verbally approved, which was technically accurate in the same way a photograph can be accurate and still show you only part of what happened. Daniel signed electronically and sent Vanessa a brief reply. "Done." Claire learned about it at 4:15 through a portal notification she technically should not have received, generated by a configuration error from an IT administrator who had since left the company. She called Carol immediately. "He signed Tranche 2, she said. "Then we have 1 tranche left before the transfer is complete," Carol said. "She will need 48 to 72 hours to set up Tranche 3. Possibly less if she has the documents prepped already." "I need to talk to Edward first," Claire said. She called the estate. Rosa answered and told her that Mr. Whitmore had had a minor health episode that morning, nothing dangerous. but his doctor had asked him to rest for several days and he was not taking calls. His personal phone was off. Claire thanked Rosa and hung up. She thought about the timing of things, how certain events arrange themselves in ways that are too convenient to be accidental and too plausible to be proven as anything else. Then she put on her coat and went to the Whitmore building. Marcus, at the lobby desk, looked genuinely uncomfortable when she walked through the door. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Hold on just a moment." He made a brief phone call, with his voice too low to hear. When he hung up, he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been given an instruction he does not personally agree with. "I have been asked to let you know that executive access to the floors involved in the current restructuring has been temporarily restricted." He was reading it. It had been written out for him. For the duration of the review period, access for non-essential personnel is limited. Non-essential personnel. Claire heard the phrase settle into the air between them. She had been coming to this building for 3 years. Marcus knew her by name. He had always held the elevator. He had sent flowers on her behalf when she had been briefly in hospital. And now he was reading her a sentence that placed her in the category of non-essential. A sentence someone upstairs had written and handed to him because they did not want to deliver it themselves. "I understand," she said. Her voice did not waver. "Thank you, Marcus." She walked back out the brass doors and stood on the sidewalk. She breathed. She called Margaret. They met an hour later in the lobby of the hotel, where Margaret was staying, while her apartment was being painted. Margaret was already there when Claire arrived, sitting near the window with sparkling water and the look of someone who had been making decisions all afternoon about how to say what she needed to say. Claire sat down and told her about the second tranche, the blocked access, what Carol had explained. Margaret listened the way she always did when something mattered, completely still, not interrupting. "What are you going to do?" Margaret said when Claire was finished. "I do not know yet," Claire said. "I am still thinking." Margaret looked at something past Claire's shoulder. Her expression shifted, a small tightening around the eyes. "He is here," she said quietly. Claire took one breath, then she turned. Daniel was crossing the lobby toward the elevator bank, coat on, phone in hand, looking at his screen as he walked. He only looked up when he was about 15 feet away, pulled by some instinct, and then he stopped. For a moment, all three of them were completely still. Margaret stood. "I am going to get some water," she said, in a tone that meant something different, and she walked toward the bar, positioned so that she could see the lobby, while appearing not to. Daniel walked over. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets. The stance of a man who has decided he is managing a situation, rather than being inside one. "I heard you came to the building this afternoon," he said. "I did," she said. "Claire, the restructuring process has a legal sensitivity right now that requires limiting access." "I know what it requires," she said. "I also know what it is doing." Something moved in his expression. "What does that mean?" She looked at him steadily. "Vanessa's initials are on a restricted internal legal memo she has no standing to access. The asset reorganization she has designed will, on completion of all three tranches, separate the founding asset from the family trust structure in a way that enables it to transfer to an outside party. The timeline she is running corresponds directly with a Carver Capital Partners board meeting at the end of this month. And your father has known about her connection to Carver for 4 months." The silence between them was complete. Daniel's face moved through several things quickly. Then, because people under real pressure sometimes reach for the nearest weapon even when it is pointed the wrong direction, he made the choice he made. "Where did you get that information?" he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, the quiet that lives just before things stop being quiet. "You have been accessing internal company documents. I have portal credentials that were never revoked. That was never intended." "It was never revoked," she said. He looked at her. The lobby moved around them. A family checking in at the front desk, someone on a phone near the window, the ordinary ongoing noise of a hotel afternoon. "You have been going through company files," he said, his voice tightening. "Files that do not belong to you. I have been trying to protect a company that my name is legally attached to, she said, which is more than I can say for the decisions being made in that building right now. She saw the moment he decided to say it. It was not an impulse. It had been sitting in him for a long time, and the pressure of this moment cracked it loose. This company was never yours, he said. You signed a contract. You signed a contract that made you my wife on paper for reasons both of us understood going in. That is all you ever were, Claire. That is all this ever was. The lobby noise continued around them. Nobody nearby had heard. It was between them only, that sentence, in 3 feet of hotel lobby carpet. That is all you ever were. From somewhere behind and to the left, she heard the very soft sound of Margaret setting down her glass. Daniel seemed to understand, a fraction of a second after the words left his mouth, what he had said. Something crossed his face. Not regret exactly, not yet, but the first thin edge of awareness of the distance between what you mean and what you have done. Claire picked up her bag. She put the strap over her shoulder. She looked at him for one long moment, and she did not say anything at all, because there was nothing to say that would do what needed doing. She walked out. She stopped 10 steps from the door. Not because she planned to. She stopped because her legs simply did not continue, and she stood there in the cold night air, and for the first time in a very long time, she stopped holding herself so carefully. The sentence landed, really landed, not at the surface where she had been managing things, but deeper, in the place she had been protecting so quietly for 3 years that she had almost convinced herself it was not there. That is all you ever were. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, not to stop herself from crying, but because her whole face hurt suddenly. The way your face hurts when something strikes exactly the spot where you have been carrying something fragile, without admitting to yourself that it was fragile. 3 years. She had told herself the silence between her and Daniel was a design she had agreed to, that wanting something more real was her problem and not his failure, that the space between them was mutual and therefore something she had signed on for. She had worked very hard to believe all of that, but some part of her had never believed it at all. Some part of her had been sitting at those dinners and wanting something real, and tonight that part of her had just been told, clearly and out loud, that it had been right to want it and completely wrong to hope for it. A woman walked past her on the sidewalk with a stroller and gave her a brief look and moved on. The city did not stop for this. It never stopped for anything. She thought about her father, not abstractly, not as a lesson she had memorized. She thought about the specific image she had carried for 23 years without ever trying to. The kitchen table in Cincinnati, the same table she had done her homework at since she was 6 years old, and Frank Hallowell sitting at it on a Tuesday morning in November when he should have been at the office. 3 days in a row at that table. Not talking, not eating much, just sitting with the shape of what he had let happen. By waiting too long to move. He had seen it coming. 2 years he had seen it. He had chosen to believe in alternative explanations because the alternative to alternative explanations was a confrontation he did not know how to survive. And, by the time he could not avoid the confrontation anymore, there was nothing left to fight for. Claire looked down at her hands in the cold November air. She was not going to sit at a table. She had spent 3 years making herself smaller in a marriage that had never asked her to be anything at all. And she was not going to spend one more day waiting for something to change on its own. She took out her phone. Her hands were steady. She noticed that. She had expected them not to be, and they were. She called Carol Shen. Carol answered on the second ring. And there must have been something in Claire's voice, because Carol said, before Claire had finished her first sentence, "I am here. Tell me what you need." "File it," Claire said. "The spousal interest claim. File it right now." A brief pause, and then Carol shifted into a different register, the clean, focused voice she used when something important was actually happening. "Are you certain?" "Yes," Claire said. "File it." "I will have it submitted within the hour," Carol said. "The 48-hour clock starts on confirmation. I will text you the timestamp." "Thank you, Carol," Claire said. She hung up. She stood on Lexington Avenue for one more moment in the cold. Then she raised her hand and flagged a cab. In the back seat, she sat quietly and watched the city move past the windows. The lit-up buildings, the headlights coming the other direction, the specific amber quality of a November evening in New York that made everything look simultaneously permanent and temporary. She did not cry. That was done. What she felt now was something quieter than emotion. The particular stillness of someone who has finally done the thing they should have done a long time ago and is now just breathing inside it. Her phone buzzed. Carol's text filed. 6:47 p.m. Clock runs to 6:47 p.m. Thursday. She read it once, put the phone in her bag. The cab took her home through the lit city, and for the first time in a very long time, Claire felt exactly like herself. Chapter 4. Everything he thought he knew about her was wrong. The first sign arrived at 7:58 in the morning as a phone call to Richard Paulson, senior partner at the firm handling the Whitmore transaction. Paulson had practiced corporate law in New York for 31 years, long enough to recognize in the first 4 seconds whether a caller was delivering news or damage. This was damage. A title search in preparation for closing documents had surfaced an encumbrance on the founding asset, a spousal interest claim, filed under the provisions of the 1987 Whitmore-Hargrove Partnership Agreement, filed the previous evening at 6:47, currently active. Paulson read Section 14 twice, then read it a third time more slowly, the way lawyers do when they are hoping to find something that changes the meaning and not finding it. He called Daniel at 8:03. Daniel was already at his desk. He had been there since 7:15, a quarterly report open on his screen, and not a word of it absorbed. He had not slept well. The lobby of the Lexington Hotel kept surfacing in his mind at intervals. Claire's face. The moment after the sentence left his mouth. The way she had looked at him before she picked up her bag and walked out without a single word in reply. Paulson delivered the situation directly. The claim was valid, filed correctly under a provision unambiguously still in force. Until released by the filing party, the founding asset could not legally change hands. Third tranche frozen. Entire transaction frozen. Who filed it? Daniel said. Claire Ann Whitmore. Silence. Get everyone in the conference room, Daniel said. 1 hour. He hung up and called Vanessa. The conference room on the 44th floor seated 20. 9 people were present when Daniel came in. Paulson, 2 associates, the internal legal team, a compliance officer, a financial controller, and Vanessa at the far end of the table. Vanessa had a legal pad in front of her and an expression that was fully composed in the way a surface is composed, when the pressure underneath it is very high. Daniel sat at the head of the table. Walk us through it, he said. Paulson walked them through it. The provision, the filing, the structural implications, the available options. Those options were limited. A legal challenge would take weeks or months, and the prior internal opinions had both found the provision enforceable. The filing party could release it voluntarily, or they could wait for the automatic lapse at 6:47 the following evening. That is our window, Vanessa said. She said it cleanly, practically, the voice of someone managing a timeline. We wait for the lapse and execute within the hour. The documents are ready. This is a 12-hour delay at most. Daniel looked at her. How do you know it lapses at 48 hours, he said. A beat. Half a second, maybe less. Standard for this type of claim, she said. It is not standard, Paulson said mildly. It is specific to the 1987 agreement. The 48-hour lapse is written into Section 14. It is not a common provision. The room went very still. Daniel's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Carver's assistant. Ready for the call whenever you are. The video meeting with Marcus Carver had been scheduled for 10 o'clock. 9:52. Set it up, Daniel said. Vanessa looked up. Something crossed her face. A fraction of movement, immediately controlled. It might be better to reschedule given the situation. Set it up, Daniel said again. Paulson's associate pulled the video conference onto the screen. While it was loading, Daniel watched Vanessa. She had turned back to her legal pad, and the set of her shoulders was different from every other meeting he had sat in with her. The screen connected. Marcus Carver appeared, silver-haired and polished in the particular way of a man who had been expensive all his life. He was in his own conference room, with one attorney visible at the edge of the frame. He looked at the people around the Whitmore table, did a quick read of the room, and settled into something carefully neutral. "Daniel," he said, "I understand there has been a development." "There has," Daniel said. "I want to discuss it directly." "Of course," Carver said smoothly. "If the filing party is persuaded that releasing the claim is in her interest, we proceed as planned. I imagine that conversation is manageable." He paused, and then he glanced toward the far end of the Whitmore table. A quick look, no more than 2 seconds. "Vanessa, you have spoken with Daniel about the flexibility on the timeline." The room went dead silent. Carver said it the way you say something to a colleague when everyone is on the same side. He said it assuming alignment, assuming Vanessa had already managed the room, assuming this was a group of coordinated people working through an obstacle together. Everyone was not on the same side. Vanessa did not move for 1 full second. Then she said, "Marcus, perhaps we should." "How long?" Daniel said. He was looking at her. His voice was completely flat. "How long have you been working with Marcus Carver?" "A beat. My professional relationships with advisory entities across the market are a standard part of my role." "How long?" he said again. "I have a consulting arrangement that predates my engagement with your company. It is a standard arrangement. With Carver Capital specifically," Daniel said. "How long?" She stopped. He waited. The room around them was so quiet. He could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling, a low, steady hum that had always been there without anyone noticing it. Vanessa looked down at her legal pad. When she looked back up, something had changed in her face, something that went deeper than her composure. A crack in the architecture of it that let you see through to what was underneath. What was underneath was not guilt exactly. It was the face of someone who had spent a very long time being excellent at something, running a long and intricate operation with discipline and patience, and had arrived at the far end of it to find there was no door. "There is a deadline," she said. Her voice was quieter than it had been all morning, from the Carver side. "End of this month. If the transaction does not close before their board meeting, the acquisition capital gets reallocated. The window closes. I have been working toward this close for some time." "How long?" Daniel said. The same question. The same. Not angry anymore. "Just exact," she said the number. "A number of years." He heard it land. He sat with it. The arithmetic of it. Where he had been at that time. What he had been doing. And when. Relative to all of that, he had first met Vanessa Lorne. A conference in London. A dinner afterward, with a group from several firms. He had sat across from him, and they had talked for 2 hours about the differences between European and American restructuring approaches. She had made him laugh twice. On the cab ride back to his hotel, he had thought she was one of the most genuinely interesting people he had encountered in a long time. He had believed that completely. He had kept believing it. For years he had kept believing it. On the screen, Marcus Carver had gone very still. The attorney at the edge of the frame had turned slightly away. The practiced disappearance of a lawyer who recognizes a room that is about to become something he does not want to have witnessed. Daniel looked at Marcus Carver on the screen for one more moment. Carver held his gaze, the move of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and intended to walk out of this one, too. "Get off my screen," Daniel said. He walked out. He pulled the door shut and stood in the corridor. He called Greer, the investigator Edward had used for 15 years, who answered on the second ring. "I need the original agreement," Daniel said. "Between Vanessa and anything connected to Carver. The earliest one you have. Your father asked me to prepare it last month," Greer said. "I can send it right now. Send it." He stood in the corridor. The document arrived in 40 seconds. 5 pages. A consulting agreement between Vanessa Lorne and Carver Strategic Partners. He knew her handwriting, had seen it on dozens of documents over the past year. knew the particular way she formed her letters. The date was March 14th. He read the year, 3 years before he met her. He walked to the row of chairs along the corridor wall near the elevator bank and sat down in one of them. The chairs existed for people who were waiting, which nobody in a building like this was supposed to have to do, because everything in a building like this was supposed to be scheduled and known in advance. He had the document on his phone screen. He had the corridor and the fluorescent light and the hum of the ventilation system and the sound of his own breathing. He had the specific, clean, terrible clarity of a man who has just stopped arguing with the evidence. He thought about a manila folder on a table between two leather chairs in a library in Greenwich, and himself standing up with his hands in his coat pockets, saying he would look at it when he had time. He thought about Claire in the lobby of a hotel on Lexington Avenue, saying the things she had said, clearly and without drama. The way you say something when you have been paying attention long enough to know exactly what you are looking at. And then he thought about what he had said to her. That is all you ever were. He sat with that sentence in the empty iron corridor on the 44th floor of his own building. He did not try to renegotiate it with himself. He did not look for a way to argue that she had provoked it, or that he had meant something different. He had meant something specific. He had said it because she had known something he did not know, and he had needed to make her smaller than that knowledge. He had said it to the one person in the entire situation who had been telling him the truth. He called Claire. Voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He sent a text, Claire, please call me back. I need to talk to you. He looked at the sent message. Then he put the phone in his pocket. He sat in the chair in the corridor and did not move. He did something he had not done in a very long time. He waited, without a plan, without a next move, without a phone call that would fix something. Just a man in a chair, holding what he had done, not yet knowing what came next, and finding, for the first time in a long time, that he could tolerate that. Chapter 5. What she decides to keep. She woke at 5:43 and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling. The apartment was quiet, the way Manhattan is quiet, only between 4 and 6 in the morning, never silent, but the particular muffled stillness of a city that has briefly stopped pretending it does not need to rest. She could hear a taxi somewhere below, the distant hum of something mechanical, and the sound of her own breathing. The claim would lapse at 6:47 that evening. 13 hours and 4 minutes. She had not slept well. Not because of the legal calculation running quietly in the back of her mind, but because she had been lying in the dark thinking about the apartment she used to live in on the Upper West Side, a one-bedroom on 82nd Street, with windows that faced a brick wall and a radiator that knocked every night at 2 in the morning. She had been thinking about how, despite everything it lacked, she had always known exactly who she was when she woke up in it. She got up, made coffee, and by 7 she was dressed and had her coat on. The Whitmore building lobby was quieter than usual when she walked in at 8:15. The kind of quiet that lives in a space when something has shifted inside it and not yet settled. Marcus was at the front desk, and his expression when he looked up was the careful neutral of a man who had been briefed overnight. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Good morning." "Good morning, Marcus." She stopped at the desk. "I am not here to go upstairs. I am meeting someone in the lobby cafe." She nodded toward the small coffee area at the far end of the lobby. "Just wanted you to know." He relaxed slightly. Of course. She ordered coffee she did not particularly need and sat at a table near the window and spread papers from Carol's office in front of her. She had been reading for about 15 minutes when she heard footsteps cross the lobby toward her with a specific quality. Deliberate, unhurried, selected. She looked up. Vanessa Lorne was dressed the way she was always dressed. Quietly expensive and perfectly assembled, not a detail out of place. Leather bag over one shoulder, a coffee of her own in hand. She approached the table with the appearance of ease that Claire had come to understand was always, with Vanessa, a form of very precise preparation. "I thought that was you," Vanessa said. "Do you mind if I sit for a minute?" Claire closed the folder. Go ahead. Vanessa sat. She set her coffee down and did not reach for it. She looked at Claire with the expression of a woman who had decided, somewhere between last night and this morning, that directness was the only card she had left. I want to make you an offer, she said. Not from Daniel, not from Marcus Carver, from me personally, as a practical conversation between two people who are both clear-eyed enough to see how this ends. You let the claim lapse at 6:45 this evening. You step back from the marriage privately with a settlement of $2.5 million transferred within 30 days. No press, no public filings, no narrative attached to your name in any of this. You get to start over somewhere clean with enough behind you to do it properly. She paused, precise and practiced. You have been in a marriage for 3 years that never gave you what a marriage is supposed to give you. You know that. He knows it. Taking this offer is not surrendering something real. It is letting go of something that was never actually yours. She stopped, waiting. Claire looked at her for a long moment. You rehearsed that, she said. Vanessa's expression did not change. I can tell because you paused in the same places twice, Claire said. Right before $2.5 million, and again before never actually yours. Those are the phrases you knew I would react to, so you put a breath before each one. She picked up her coffee. You have done this before, sat across from someone and made the math sound clean. The math is clean, Vanessa said. No, Claire said. It is the version you need me to believe is clean. I am not going to take the settlement. Something shifted in Vanessa's eyes. A quick recalculation, the rapid revision of a plan, built on a particular assumption about what Claire wanted, and the slow recognition that the assumption was wrong. You understand that if this collapses entirely, the consequences go in all directions, Vanessa said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. What was underneath was harder and more direct. There are documents in this process that could be interpreted in ways that are uncomfortable for the Whitmore family. For Edward specifically. For the company's standing with regulatory bodies. I have no interest in deploying those. But if the transaction collapses because of what you filed, those documents, Claire said, were submitted to the SEC's Corporate Enforcement Division at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Vanessa went completely still. By Edward, Claire said. He has been working with the SEC for the past 6 weeks. The submission covers Meridian Advisory Group. The wire transfer pattern between Meridian and your personal account. The consulting agreement you signed with Carver Strategic Partners on March 14th, and the specific mechanism by which the asset reorganization was structured to accomplish the transfer. The documents you were planning to use were the first thing Edward addressed. He has been doing this for 40 years, and he knows that when you have a problem, you put it on the table yourself before someone else puts it there for you. The lobby was ordinary around them. Someone crossed to the elevator. The front desk phone rang and was answered. The normal morning of a building that did not know or care what was happening at a small table near the window. Then something happened in Vanessa that Claire had not quite expected. Not a breakdown, not tears. What happened was quieter and in some ways more unsettling than either of those things. Vanessa's face moved through a rapid interior sequence. The loss of the calculation. The loss of the contingencies. The loss of all the prepared ground she had been standing on for years. And what was left was something bare and oddly young. You should know, Vanessa said. Her voice was different now, stripped of the professional register entirely. I went into this knowing exactly what it was. Every step of it. I knew the timeline and the target and the mechanism. She stopped. Her hands, which had been still on the table, moved slightly, a small unconscious adjustment. I did not plan for the rest of it. What I told him yesterday, in the meeting, that was the truth. I need you to know that even if it changes nothing. Claire looked at her for a moment. I know, she said, and she did know, or suspected it, and it made no practical difference. But what you planned and what you did are the same document, Vanessa. The signature does not care about the intention. Vanessa looked at the table. Call your attorney, Claire said, standing and gathering her papers into the folder. Right now. Not after you finish your coffee. Not after you figure out the next angle. Now she picked up her coat. She looked down at Vanessa one more time. Vanessa did not look up. Claire walked across the lobby, past Marcus, who held the door without being asked, and out onto Park Avenue. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold November morning air, not feeling triumphant, not feeling the specific satisfaction of a victory, feeling something quieter than both of those, the feeling of a person who has done what needed doing and is now, for the first time in longer than she could measure, standing in a moment that belongs entirely to herself. She had 4 hours before the board met. She walked north and flagged a cab. The board convened at 11 o'clock in the main conference room on the 44th floor. Daniel was not in it. Helen Park, the board's independent chair, who had served on the Whitmore board for 9 years and ran it with a combination of rigor and fairness that made people both respect and slightly fear her, had sent a message through the board secretary that morning. Given the nature of the legal and regulatory situation now in process, it was appropriate for the board to convene independently to evaluate the asset reorganization and Daniel's role in initiating it. He was not being removed. He was not being formally suspended. He was being asked, as a matter of governance, to allow the board to function without him in the room while it assessed the facts. It was the most carefully worded exclusion Daniel had ever received. He sat in the corridor outside the conference room, the same stretch of hallway where he had sat the day before, with Greer's document on his phone. Through the frosted glass of the conference room door, he could see the shapes of people seated around the table. He could not hear what was being said. He did not try. There was nothing he could do. That was the specific and unfamiliar reality of the situation. He had spent his professional life in rooms where there was always something. A lever to pull, a call to make, a deal to restructure, a check that solved the immediate problem. He had built his sense of himself around being the person who knew what the next move was. He was in a corridor with no next move, and the door was closed, and he had put himself here through a series of choices that had each made perfect sense individually and made no sense at all when you laid them end to end and read them in order. He thought about his father, about the library, the folder on the table himself, standing up with his hands in his coat pockets and saying he would look at it when he had time. He thought about Edward sitting alone in that chair after the door closed, picking up his coffee, finding it had gone cold. The 40 years his father had spent building something, and the 4 months he had spent holding information quietly, waiting, giving his son the chance to act first. That was a specific and costly kind of patience, and Daniel had not been worth it. At some point during the second hour, James Aldrich's assistant came out of the conference room to retrieve a document from the hallway printer. He was a young man who had attended probably 40 meetings in this building. He stopped when he saw Daniel sitting in the chair by the wall. He looked at him for a moment. The expression on his face was not disrespect. It was something worse. It was the look of someone who does not know how to arrange their features when they see something they were not expecting to see. He nodded briefly and moved past, without saying anything. Daniel watched him go. He sat back in the chair. That look, that specific, helpless, politely averted look from a young man who had never had reason to think about Daniel Whitmore as anything other than the man who ran the building. There was no check for that. There was no call that fixed that. There was only the hallway and the frosted glass and the shapes of people deciding things on the other side of the door. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. When Helen Park came out, she stood in the corridor with a folder under her arm and gave him the summary in the direct language she used, when directness was the only appropriate thing. The board was freezing all asset decisions pending full review of the reorganization, the SEC filing, and the legal status of the current claim. His position as CEO was not being formally altered, but his authority over asset transactions was suspended until the review was complete. The process would be thorough and would take as long as it took. He should expect extensive questioning in the coming days. She looked at him for a moment after she was done. "You are going to need a very good attorney," she said. "Not the firm that handled the transaction. Someone you chose yourself for your interests specifically." "I know," he said. She nodded once and walked toward the elevator. He sat back down in the corridor chair. He thought about what a phone call, a check, a well-placed favor would get him out of in this situation. He turned the question over carefully and arrived at the same answer both times. Nothing. There was nothing to buy his way out of. There was only the process and the time it required, and the things he had done. He did not know where Claire was. He had no reason to know. But somewhere in the part of him that had been paying more attention than he realized, he thought he knew where she might be. He got up and went to find his coat. The offices of Hargrove and Whitmore Legal Partners, a small suite preserved from the original enterprise on the 12th floor of a building on 57th Street, held 20 years of original company documents and a conference room that Claire had used in the early days of the marriage for certain paperwork. It was the address on their original contract. The first place in the Whitmore world that had ever had her name on anything. She was in the conference room when Daniel arrived. The door was open. She was sitting at the table with papers in front of her and her coat on the back of the chair, and she looked up when she heard him in the doorway. She did not look surprised. She almost never did, and standing in the doorway of this small room on 57th Street, he finally understood what that meant. It was not composure as a wall. It was the natural expression of someone who had been paying careful attention for so long that very few things arrived without some prior signal she had already registered. "I did not know you would be here," she said. "I know," he said. "I did not call ahead." "No." He came in and sat down in the chair to her left, close enough that there was no managed distance between them. He did not have a speech. He had specifically not prepared one, because any version of this that had been rehearsed was still a version that was managing something, and he was done managing this. The consulting agreement between Vanessa and Carver Strategic Partners was dated March 14th, he said. 3 years ago. I was at a conference in London in March of that year. That is where I met her. 7 months after she signed that agreement. He looked at his hands on the table. I have been going through every conversation I remember from that first dinner in London. She asked about the Whitmore Company within the first 10 minutes. I thought she was professionally curious. I thought it was interesting that she already knew who we were. He stopped. I was exactly what they needed me to be. The room was quiet. Down the hall, a phone rang twice and went to voicemail. And in that hotel lobby, he said, "What I said to you." She started to say something. "I want to say it plainly," he said. "What I said to you in that lobby was the worst thing I have said to another person in my adult life. And I said it knowing it would land. I said it because you knew something I did not know, and I could not tolerate that, and I needed to make you smaller than what you knew. And I said it to the one person in this entire situation who had been telling me the truth the entire time." He looked at her directly. "There is nothing I can do about having said it. I know that. I am not asking you to pretend it did not happen." Claire was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came through the window at a low November angle, gold and brief. "I filed the claim because of my father," she said. He had not expected that, she told him, not as a lesson, and not as something asking for anything in return. She told him about Frank Hallowell and Gerald Bryce, and 4 years of watching signs her father chose not to read, and the kitchen table in Cincinnati. She told him about the 15-year-old girl who had made a decision sitting at that table that she had never named out loud, but had never once deviated from. She told him about the 3 years of the marriage during which she had slowly made herself smaller, had told herself the silence between them was a mutual design, had kept her portal access and her 18 months of reading entirely to herself, because she was not certain she had the standing to act. "Your father's toast gave me standing," she said, "and then you took it away in about 30 seconds in a hotel lobby. And I decided I believed him more than I believed you." He said nothing for a moment. "You should have," he said. "He was right. He usually is." And I have spent 10 years making a second career out of not wanting to admit it. She looked at him carefully. Really looked the way she had always looked at things. And he understood for the first time that she had been looking at him this way for 3 years, and he had been too busy looking elsewhere to notice. The board suspended your authority over asset transactions, she said. Helen Park called me. He almost smiled. She called you. She said I should know the full picture. She also mentioned that you sat in that corridor the entire 2 hours and 20 minutes without making a single call. There was no call to make, he said. There was nothing to call anyone about. There was just sitting with what I had done. A pause. No, she said. There was not. The afternoon light in the window had shifted, deepening from gold toward gray, the way November light moves fast in the late afternoon in New York. 4:22. The claim would lapse at 6:47. Claire looked at the release form on top of the stack. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "Ask me." He understood immediately. He did not reach for anything diplomatic or careful. He asked the way you ask when you are not working toward a particular answer. The claim, he said. Do you want to sign the release? She looked at him steadily. Are you asking me, or are you asking on behalf of the company? I am asking you, he said. Just you. She held his gaze for a long moment. The room was very still. Outside on 57th Street, the city moved in its ordinary afternoon way, the sound of it muffled and distant, as though this small conference room had its own weather entirely. Then she picked up the pen from the table. The company is going to be fine, she said. Edward will see to that, and your father is going to outlive everyone in this building. She looked at the release form. I am signing this because I choose to, not because the clock is running. Not because of Vanessa, or the board, or the SSE, or any other reason, because it is what I want to do. She signed it. Her handwriting was clear and unhurried, the signature of someone who had made up their mind long before the pen touched the paper. She set the pen down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, not taking it, not holding it, just resting there, his hand over her hand on the table. The way you reach towards something carefully when you are not yet sure you have the right to hold it. She looked down at their hands. The room was very quiet. She did not pull away. They sat like that for a moment in the small conference room in the building on 57th Street, the gold light almost entirely gone from the window now. Two people who had arrived at the same place by very different roads and were not yet sure what to call it. Only that they were both standing in it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. He lifted his hand slowly. Then he said something he had not planned to say. I did not know you had been reading the company's legal history, he said. 18 months of it. I did not know you were capable of that. A pause. That is the problem, she said quietly. You did not know because you never asked. He looked at her. You are right, he said. I did not ask. Go see your father, she said. He's been waiting for you to call him. I know, he said. She gathered her papers and stood and put on her coat. At the doorway, she paused with her hand on the frame and turned back. Edward called me his daughter, she said, when he handed over the message from Greer in the estate library. She looked at Daniel. That was the first time anyone in your family called me that. He said nothing, because there was no good response to that. Only the plain truth of it, which was a failure, his specifically. No sentence he could construct was going to do anything useful with it, except acknowledge it, honestly. I know, he said. She looked at him for one more second. Then she walked out. He sat alone in the small conference room, looking at the chair where she had been, the pen on the table, the release form with her signature, the window where the last of the November gold had given way to the early dark of evening. He sat for a long time, not because he had nowhere to be, but because sitting with what had happened, all of it, without framing it or managing it or reaching for the next move, felt like the right thing to do. Then he picked up his phone and called his father. Edward answered on the second ring. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in December, Margaret was already at the corner table when Claire arrived. The same coffee shop on 48th Street, they had ended up in by accident in the rain on a November afternoon when they had been headed somewhere else. The coffee was still adequate and the table was still slightly wobbly, and over the past several weeks it had become theirs in the way that places become yours when you keep showing up without planning to. Margaret had ordered for both of them. She had her coat on the chair beside her and her phone face down on the table, the Margaret Whitmore equivalent of clearing her schedule. The review board met again yesterday, Margaret said, when Claire sat down. 4.5 hours. I heard, Claire said. His exposure is limited. He signed what he was given, and there is no evidence he had prior knowledge of the Carver arrangement. He will come through it professionally. She wrapped her hands around her mug. What is more interesting to me is that for 3 weeks now, I have not heard him make a single call for leverage or positioning or damage control. He talked to the investigators. He talked to the new attorney, who is excellent, by the way, Edward's recommendation. And he went to Greenwich last Thursday. Rosa said they had dinner afterward, just the two of them, and that it was the quietest dinner that Library had seen in 20 years. She meant it as a compliment. He called me, Margaret said, 2 nights ago. We talked for 45 minutes about nothing in particular, and at the end of the call he said something I have never heard him say in 47 years. What did he say? Claire said. He said he was wrong, Margaret said. Not wrong about a decision with the benefit of hindsight. Not wrong, given information he had not had at the time. Just wrong. About what he valued and what he showed it to, and what he said in a hotel lobby to someone who deserved considerably better. She looked at Claire, then said and his good night and hung up before I could respond, which is very Daniel, but still. Claire was quiet for a moment. He asked me, she said finally, when I signed the release, he asked me specifically what I wanted, not what the company needed, not what the situation required. He asked me. Margaret looked at her across the wobbly table. He put his hand over mine, Claire said. When I set the pen down, just for a moment, he did not say anything. He just put his hand there and left it. She was quiet again. Outside the window, 48th Street was going through its Tuesday morning business. Pedestrians and delivery carts, and the ordinary December purposes of the city. Do you know what I thought? Claire said. Tell me, Margaret said. I thought, that is the first time. She looked at Margaret. Not the first time he touched my hand. The first time it felt like he was actually present when he did it, like he was actually there. The coffee shop moved around them. Someone picked up an order at the counter. The door opened and let in a rush of December air and swung shut again. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, So, Claire said. She picked up her coffee with both hands, the way you hold something warm when the morning is cold, and you are thinking about more than one thing at once. She looked out the window at 48th Street. She thought about the kitchen table in Cincinnati, and the 3 days her father had sat at it, and the decision she had made during those 3 days without knowing she was making it. She had carried that decision her whole adult life, the absolute refusal to be the person who waited too long to move. She had moved. She had stood on a sidewalk in the dark and looked down at her hands and decided she was worth the cost of moving, and she had called Carol, and the world had not ended. The company was intact. She was intact. And a man who had spent 47 years needing to be right had called his sister at night and said plainly that he was wrong. That was not nothing. I think I want to see what he does with it, she said. Margaret's face opened into the real smile she did not often let out, wide and warm and completely unguarded. Then she said, I think you should probably answer his next call. Claire looked at her. And then, in a coffee shop on 48th Street, on a Tuesday morning in December, at a table that was still slightly wobbly and had adequate coffee, and was theirs by accident and by repetition, and by the specific warmth of two women who had found each other at the edge of a difficult 3 years, Claire Halliwell Whitmore smiled back, not because everything was resolved, not because the hard part was finished, because it was not by a long way, but because she had stood on a sidewalk in November and decided she was worth fighting for, and she had been right about that. And the man she had not expected to love had placed his hand over hers and stayed there in the quiet without saying a word. And that, she thought, was not the end of something. It was the beginning. She set her coffee down on the slightly wobbly table. She looked at Margaret across it. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She opened it. She found Daniel's name, and she pressed call. She did not wait to decide. She had decided. Outside the window, 48th Street carried on in the way the city always carries on, indifferent and magnificent and entirely itself. And inside the coffee shop, in the quiet between the first ring and the second, Claire sat up straight and waited for him to answer.